Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And a bit of a change in setting, but it's the Biosphere worst to best ranking. So I figured, given how Biosphere's music often reminds me of being in outdoor settings, I should also have a bit of a change in setting. And this isn't technically outdoors. It's a storage shed behind my family's house, but close enough. There's no heating in here, and it probably wasn't totally safe to record somewhere without a roof over me, given how crap the weather around here is this time of year. Actually, it's not that bad today, but I digress. So yes, we're finally finishing off this series. Ordinarily, I'd finish off a discography review with a top 10 list of my favorite individual tracks, but that felt kind of weird to do for Biosphere because I so rarely think about his stuff in the context of individual tracks. Maybe my top 10 tracks would look something like this, I don't know. But he is very much an album artist, and a worst to best ranking felt more fitting to close out the series, which has been going on for plenty long enough already. And I'm sure some of you can't wait to get to the next one. I can't either. But I may as well get into it. Disclaimer, as usual, that this is just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. I may even end up disagreeing with it myself after a few months, or depending on my mood. Not a final ranking either, and this video only concerns the main studio albums. Basically, the 12 main Biosphere albums that got proper reviews, and nothing covered in the odds and ends video, so no Insomnia, no Petrified Forest, none of that. Just the ones I did reviews on. So yeah, let's get into it. This is
Here in this desert, it's just the same.
Biosphere, worst to best. At number 12, I have L'Incarnazione de Popea. Yeah, surprise. This is the only release I think I've heard from Geir Jenssen that I think just flat out sucks. And it's a shame because I do think the idea behind it is interesting and not like any other I've heard before. I've seen it described as glitch opera, but it's a really shallow take on the idea that just takes repetitive opera samples and covers them in a samey and irritating tremolo effect that wavers at the same pace through every track and gets grating in record time. Not to mention the album's really short and feels pretty substanceless. I mean, Biosphere can usually pull off albums that do a lot with a little, but this one just didn't result in an engaging or fun listen in any way, and yeah, I can't honestly recommend it to anyone. Whoosh. At number 11, I have Autour de la Lune. Most of the lowest ranked Biosphere albums just kind of fall under being okay to me. This one, if absolutely nothing else, I get the appeal and feel like Biosphere succeeded in what he was trying to do. But in a catalog full of minimalistic recordings, Autour is by far the most minimalistic and has the least to it. A lot of tracks here are just bass rumbling, and if you don't have a good pair of headphones that can pick up those frequencies, then much of this album could come off as completely silent. I do feel like the album is well paced and structured in such a way that it doesn't get too boring. Each of the tracks, as sparse as they are, do all have an identity in some way. And to say that it didn't generate an emotional reaction would be lying as well. This album is legitimately spooky and unnerving in a good way. But I don't know, this was a bit too sparse for me to really consider one of my personal favorites. I imagine at least a couple of people can rank it a lot higher than me. Again, I just think it's okay, and I understand the appeal. I still think it's worth giving a shot if you like stuff on the more minimal side, but I tend to prefer Biosphere albums that have a bit more substance. Whoosh. At number 10, we have Departed Glories. Another album that is a cool idea, but just didn't really go the extra mile for me. Inspired by his time in the forests of Poland and a story he heard of an ancient medieval queen who had to hide in said forest from an incoming invasion, this album is a collection of 17 short and airy pieces that surmise what kind of music such a queen would hear. Like the kind of stuff that fear would conjure up in her mind. Sampling various snippets of Eastern European folk music and choir music and rendering them near unrecognizable as these ghostly, formless drone pieces. The kind of stuff that really makes you question whether or not what you're hearing is actually there. Fascinating concept, but once again I feel like this album didn't have much substance to back it up. Like, enough to pull the concept off, but I could barely tell apart any of the 17 pieces on here, and none of them left a strong enough impression on me to, like, stick out in my head in any way. It's such an airy listen that feels like it's barely even there, and I don't know. I feel like there are other albums of his that try something similar but feel a bit more grounded and are easier for me to get myself immersed in. And most of my favorite moments from here are the ones that remind me of his previous work. Still cool stuff, could work as a Halloween album, gave it that treatment and the review, but not a personal favorite. Whoosh. At number 9, I have the Hilverenbeek recordings. You know, I really liked this album when it first came out and I reviewed it. I think it's got a unique feel that you can't get out of any other Biosphere album, more inspired by the countryside as seen on the album cover and doing its best to transport you to that kind of place through its field recordings and minimal synth doodles. It's also probably Biosphere's single most pleasant listening experience. It's very light, has little to no tension, in an enjoyable way that can lighten my own mood. But not to say I don't have serious problems with this now. It's admittedly shrunk on me quite a bit since my initial video. Main problem I have is just its length. It's way too short and barely feels like an album at all. It bookends itself with 2 near identical pieces, and the actual musical elements feel like they're taking a backseat to the field recordings. The field recordings are still cool, they pick up a lot of minor details, and justify this move to some extent, but still, as a whole, it's not much of an album. Despite a similar album cover, it sure as hell is no KLF's Chill Out. I'd more highly recommend that. But I guess this is still worth checking out if you think it sounds interesting. Whoosh. At number 8, I got Potashnik. I imagine this is probably ranked lower on other people's rankings. I feel like it's the only album in the Biosphere catalog that feels like a straight rehash of something else he did. There's nothing here that you couldn't already get out of his debut album, Microgravity. Pretty much identical from a stylistic standpoint, and doesn't move that straightforward ambient techno sound forward in any way. As for why it's not even lower, well, I just feel like this album has more reason for me to return to it than anything below it on the list. As straightforward and unoriginal as this album is, and despite kinda losing steam in the final third or so, it does have quite a few good tracks that I find worth returning to, like Novelty Waves and The Shield and the title track, the latter of which was the first Biosphere track I ever heard. Also SETI Project, which is still probably the single most energetic track Geir Jenssen has ever made in his entire lifetime. I do still find it a pretty cohesive project all around, flows together pretty well. I do feel like it has some merit in my keeping it around on my iPod, but it hasn't aged well, it sounds quite dated, and there's lots of other albums that you can listen to from other people or from him that could give you a similar experience and do it better. Whoosh. At number 7, I have Cirque. Alright, Cirque. Gonna be honest, I was really expecting this one to be a lot higher. Before I actually started this series, I thought it was gonna be my number 2 pick on this list. Yeah, no. Then I thought it was gonna be my number 4 pick, and also, no. It is kind of a shame because it is obviously in the top half. I think it is one of his most creative projects, introduced a lot of new ideas that weren't in his previous albums, it's well-paced and interesting throughout. Each track is unique sounding, including the interludes, and all fit together pretty well, and there is like a weirdly comforting vibe I get out of the whole thing. It's a good album to willingly detach yourself from society to. Also, it has the track Iberia Eteria, which is one of his best tracks, period. And I also love Black Lamb and Grey Falcon and Algae and Fungi. There's plenty of good stuff here. The problem is, all of this has been topped. Not by leagues of other artists, as is the case with Microgravity and Potashnik, but just by his own stuff afterwards. All the new ideas explored here were further refined on later albums of his, especially Drop Sound and Shenzhou. And in hindsight, Cirque really can't compete. It doesn't get nearly the same rush out of me that those 2 albums can. Well, I don't know if rush is really the right word to use for such a low-key album, but you get what I mean. This is still a very good album with creative ideas and couldn't have come out of any other artist. I'm still gonna keep it around. Just not the best stuff he's ever done. And speaking of albums that introduce new sounds but have been topped in some way, whoosh. At number 6, I have Microgravity.
Straight as you go.
Microgravity and Patachnik are basically the exact same album, but this one has several benefits, such as basically being the first one ever to try this sound. This ambient techno sound has been absolutely done to death, and the whole Warp Records Artificial Intelligence series feels like it was inspired by the kinds of sounds that this album created. It benefits a lot more from its historical perspective and from how massively influential it turned out to be, even if I personally feel that, like Patachnik, it hasn't aged very well and isn't the best sounding iteration of this style that's ever been done. The fact that it came out back in 1991 kinda shows. But it's far from the worst iteration of this style. There are a lot of solid tracks here that are worth coming back to, like Cygnus A and Baby Interface and Tranquilizer and all those. It is a pretty chill ambient techno release that can still get your foot tapping. It's a pretty solid project even to this day. Coming back to it after this entire series was over, I went back to really liking it. Not infinitely replayable, obviously. I did get really sick of it when I reviewed it. And as I've said, I think there are plenty of albums out there that follow this same style and sound but do it better. And plenty that do it worse. But yeah, I think Microgravity really holds up, all things considered, and shows Biosphere to be a really forward-thinking artist, especially for his time. I might have underrated it a bit in my initial review thanks to personal overplay. It's still pretty good stuff. Whoosh. At number 5, I have the Senja recordings. Alright, the newest one. Yeah, this one's probably gonna end up on my 2019 year-end list somewhere. This album may have a lot in common with many of my least favorite albums of his, mainly Autour de la Lune and Hilverenbeek recordings, but it still does more stuff than either of those albums, and presents similar ideas with a lot more dimensionality. These tracks are all still super minimal. There's rarely much to any of the 17 tracks on here than some simplistic synth doodles or field recordings of various sources, but they all add up to a well-defined atmosphere, the kind of album that feels like it takes place in an area that used to be next to a glacier, but no longer is, because climate change. No track feels like it sticks around longer than it needs to, and all of them have an identity. There's plenty enough variety to keep me interested the whole time. It's a dark and harrowing album that tends to remind me more of our ongoing environmental crisis than anything, and also the reason I decided to film this video inside a storage shed. There are multiple tracks from this album that are just field recordings of the interior of a storage shed like this one. Oh, maybe a bit less crappy one. But all of them have like a kind of a musical quality to them. It's hard to explain really. But I mean, if you've been turned off by the last couple of projects that Biosphere's put out in the last couple of years, maybe give this one a shot. It's his best work in a very long time. Whoosh. At number 4, I have N-Plants. This one is really neck and neck with Senja recordings. I think that album's probably more consistent than this one, and Plants does take a while to really get going and doesn't become truly great until around its second half. Also probably less original than Senja as well. I think it goes for a fairly straightforward ambient techno sound that I've heard plenty of stuff like before. But this one undoubtedly has better standouts, and despite not being his most consistent or original, still does what it tries to do very well. I definitely prefer this over Microgravity. Not only do I think the production is a major step up thanks to its use of more modern synths and generally better sonic clarity, but I also think the concept is a lot more interesting. It aims to make you feel like you're in a Japanese nuclear power plant. And sure, everyone around you is telling you that everything is totally safe and clean, but there's still that thought in the back of your head wondering how safe it really is. And he finished making it right before the Fukushima nuclear disaster happened, so yeah, kinda unsettling to say the least. That concept holds up the weaker moments on this album and still makes them feel like they serve a purpose. But it's moments on here like the incomparable Genkai 1 that pushed it past Senja recordings for me. That one track is one of my absolute favorites Biosphere has ever done. And there's plenty of other tracks that deliver creepy but still accessible melodies all around. I don't imagine N-Plants is for everyone, but it's not one I would say is worth missing. Give it a shot. Whoosh. And number 3, I have Drop Sund. Alright, here we go. Now we're into the top tier stuff. Drop Sund is an excellent project. It's unquestionably his warmest, most summery, and most comforting album, but it doesn't feel like it's sacrificing any of his experimentalism to achieve that effect. Especially love his use of these jazzy break beats on tracks like Birds Fly by Flapping Their Wings and In Triple Time, but also its more low-key moments like the ancient-sounding Warmed by the Drift and its especially enveloping blends, or some of the more subtle Boards of Canada-esque moments, like Dissolving Clouds or People Are Friends, or some moments that don't really fit into any of those molds, like Alto Stratus and Sherbrooke. It's a rock-solid project. I wouldn't even blink if someone said it was their number one pick on this list. It's not mine, though. I've got two others I like more, and probably should be able to figure out which two those are. And number 2, I have Shenzhou. You know, I almost dropped this album a spot lower purely because I listened to it like the other day during a commute, which turned out 70 minutes longer than it usually is. And I might have personally ruined it for myself in some ways, but I'm not going to be that petty. This is an album that gets by on some of the most subtle and stripped back arrangements he's ever made, often not doing anything besides looping snippets of old Debussy recordings. But this album just has so much emotional nuance to it that I can't fully put into words. It's a truly haunting record. Maybe a bit of a cliche to say that it feels like a movie soundtrack almost, but specifically it feels like it soundtracks like this fully animated psychological character piece where someone living by themselves out in the wilderness has to deal with their broken past or something. And on top of that, the reissue version has a pretty cool bonus album called The Samphire Tower. It sounds pretty much nothing like the main album, much more about subtle synths and field recordings, but I liked it enough to put on my iPod as a separate album, so that's cool. And I guess that brings us to the very top of the list, where I made the most freaking predictable choice imaginable. At number 1, I have Subliminal Sandwich. Excuse me, I appear to be reading my computer upside down. That's a Meat Beat Manifesto album. I'm at Substrata. I mean, come on, was it gonna be anything else? Obviously, I believe there's more to Biosphere than just this album. He has plenty of other great albums, but there's really no competition for the top spot, personally. Substrata is one of the best ambient music albums of all time. So thoroughly chilling from start to end, so well enveloping you in its icy Arctic atmosphere, perfectly paced with no track overstaying its welcome, and despite many tracks here being quite repetitive, you wish they all went on even longer. Well-balanced variety from track to track, no redundant spots, and even like Shenzhou, a bonus album that's just as much worth your time, but even better, as it actively helps play into the sound of the album and expand it to give it even more variety and feel larger than life. As far as ambient music goes, this album's pretty much perfect, and even after this whole series and going through all these albums, after putting together a 35-minute video of all his obscure projects and getting pretty sick of his style, I went back to Substrata, and all was forgiven. Yeah, I have nothing but the highest praise for this album, as do most people I've come across. If somehow you've never heard anything by this guy, absolutely make sure to give this a listen. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, you're making me a review of something, link to my Patreon is in the description. And that's the end of this discography review. I wonder who the next one could be.